For $100, you could probably buy a personality. Might be worth looking into. The words, slick with cheap whiskey and unearned authority, slithered across the worn linoleum of the last stop diner. The crowd, a sparse collection of dusty farmers and weary long-haul truckers, offered up a few nervous, sycophantic chuckles. They knew the script. Sheriff Brody was on his stage, and his performances demanded an audience, however reluctant. His target was the waitress, the new one, the one who moved with a strange economy and never seemed to smile. Her name tag read Anna. She didn't react. Her hands, steady and sure, continued their methodical work, wiping down the gleaming chrome of a napkin dispenser as if the sheriff's voice were nothing more than the buzz of a dying fluorescent light overhead. Her silence was a vacuum, and Brody, a man who detested any space he couldn't fill with the sound of his own importance, felt compelled to rush into it. He sauntered closer, his gut preceding him like a declaration of his own appetites, his hand resting on the holstered pistol at his hip as if it were a scepter. But when the old man in the corner booth, the one nursing a single black coffee for the past 2 hours, subtly shifted his weight and his gaze fell upon the waitress's stance. Feet perfectly shoulder-width apart, balanced, center of gravity so low and solid it seemed anchored to the very foundation of the building. He saw something else entirely. He saw not a victim, but a coiled spring, a study in potential energy that the loud, oblivious sheriff was treating like a discarded dish rag. A flicker of recognition, distant and profound, crossed the old man's weathered face. He'd seen that stance before, in places where the dust was measured in feet, not inches, and where a moment's imbalance was the difference between a flight home and a flag-draped casket. He leaned forward just an inch, his eyes narrowing. The air in the diner grew thick, heavy with the unspoken history of a town held hostage by one man's ego and the silent acquiescence of its people. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, that competence is its own credential, and that respect is a currency earned in deeds, not words, type silence below. The stage was set, the players in their places, but the sheriff, in his blinding arrogance, had misread the entire play, casting the story's unmovable hero in the role of a disposable extra. The silence that followed his insult was not one of submission. It was the deep, patient breath before the storm, a quiet promise of a reckoning that was already in motion, as inevitable as the sunrise. The town had forgotten what true authority looked like, but it was about to get a lesson it would never, ever forget, a lesson delivered not from a badge, but from a broken coffee cup and the ghost of 1,000 life-or-death decisions held in the steady gaze of a woman named Anna. The sheriff took another step, his boots scuffing on the checkered floor, a sound that seemed to scrape against the raw nerves of everyone present. He enjoyed this part, the slow escalation, the visible tightening of shoulders, and the downward cast of eyes from the other patrons. It was a confirmation of his power, a ritual of dominance that fed his brittle pride. "What's the matter, sweetheart? Cat got your tongue," he sneered, leaning his bulk against the countertop. The Formica groaned under his weight. "Or are you just simple? Is that it? Hired you out of pity, did they? Let the slow girl pour some coffee. Make her feel useful." His words were not just insults. They were scalpels, intended to dissect and display her supposed inadequacy for the entire town to see. He was making an example of her, reinforcing the unspoken rule of his territory. He was the sun, and everyone else merely orbited his gravitational pull of contempt. Anna finished with a napkin dispenser. She turned, her movements fluid and unhurried, and picked up a heavy glass coffee pot from the warmer. Her focus was absolute. She moved toward his table, her expression as neutral as a clear sky. It was this very calmness, this utter refusal to engage with his pageantry, that infuriated him the most. It was a quiet, profound rejection of his authority. He was a roaring fire, and she was a block of ice, refusing to melt. He saw it not as strength, but as defiance. "I'm talking to you," he growled, his voice dropping into a lower, more menacing register. His hand shot out not to grab the pot, but to grab her arm. It was a mistake. The moment his fingers closed around her bicep, he might as well have grabbed a granite pillar. There was no give, no soft tissue, only a dense, unyielding hardness that felt alien, unnatural for a woman of her slight build. For a split second, a flicker of confusion crossed his face. But his ego, a monstrous and fragile thing, could not allow for confusion. It demanded rage. He interpreted her physical solidity as yet another act of defiance. With a snarl of frustration, he released her arm and, in a motion fueled by whiskey and wounded pride, swung his open hand. The sound of the slap was a gunshot in the quiet diner. It was sharp, ugly, and final. A collective gasp, quickly stifled, rippled through the room. A fork clattered onto a plate. The cook in the back froze, his spatula hovering over the grill. Time itself seemed to hang suspended, caught in the ringing aftermath of the blow. Anna's head barely moved. She absorbed the impact with the same impossible stillness, her body swaying less than a stalk of wheat in a summer breeze. Her cheek, now blooming with a violent red, was the only evidence of the assault. She didn't cry out. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, the hot coffee pot held steady in her hand, her eyes, clear and cold and utterly devoid of fear, locked onto his. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room inverted. He had struck her to prove his dominance, but her silence, her profound and unshakable calm, screamed his failure. He was the one who looked weak, who had lost control, who had resorted to cheap violence against an unarmed woman. The red on her cheek was not a mark of her shame, but a brand upon his. The sudden, violent screech of tires tearing at asphalt shattered the fragile tension inside the diner. It was a sound of pure mechanical panic, followed instantly by the brutal, percussive crumpling of metal on metal. Outside, a blue and white armored van, its side emblazoned with the logo of a regional bank, now sat twisted at an impossible angle, its front end buried in the thick trunk of an ancient oak tree that had stood sentinel on the edge of the diner's parking lot for a century. Before the echo of the crash had even faded, the staccato crack of automatic gunfire erupted, peppering the street with deadly rhythm. The diner's large plate glass window, which had just moments before reflected the lazy afternoon sun, exploded inward in a crystalline shower of 1,000 glittering shards. Patrons screamed and dove for cover, tables scraping violently against the floor as they became makeshift barricades. Sheriff Brody, caught between his fading bravado and the sudden onslaught of genuine chaos, reacted with pure, instinctual cowardice. He ducked behind the counter, his face pale, his hand fumbling for his pistol with all the grace of a man trying to catch a greased pig. Deputies outside, set up a perimeter. Return fire, he bellowed, his voice a reedy, panic squeak that held none of its earlier booming authority. Through the shattered window, his two deputies could be seen scrambling from their patrol car, taking cover behind the doors in a textbook but tactically useless position. They were exposed, pinned down, their sidearms looking like children's toys against the high-caliber chatter of the assailants' rifles. One of the deputies cried out, clutching his shoulder. The situation was spiraling, a violent vortex of incompetence and overwhelming force. But inside the diner, a different kind of shift was occurring. It was quiet, almost imperceptible. As the first rounds tore through the window, Anna hadn't ducked or screamed. Instead, she had placed the coffee pot back on its warmer with deliberate, almost reverent care. The waitress was gone. In her place stood something else, something honed and tempered in crucibles far hotter than this dusty roadside town. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, and her eyes, which had been placid moments before, now scanned the unfolding chaos outside with a chillingly analytical gaze. They were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a predator, calculating angles, assessing threats, and mapping the geometry of violence with a speed that defied comprehension. She took in the deputies' poor positioning, the assailants' firing patterns, the available cover and concealment within the diner. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of tactical reality, was processing the entire scenario, not as a terrifying event, but as a problem set, a complex equation waiting for a simple, elegant, and brutally effective solution. The fear that had saturated the air was a foreign element to her. She breathed a different atmosphere, one of precision, action, and absolute professional calm. Two figures, clad in black tactical gear and carrying short-barreled rifles, burst through the diner's shattered doorway. They moved with a clumsy aggression, their eyes wild with adrenaline, clearly expecting a room full of terrified, compliant civilians. They were here for hostages, for leverage. "Nobody move. Everybody on the floor now," the first one yelled, his voice muffled by a ski mask. This was his fatal error. He was giving an order, assuming a position of power in a room where the true apex of power was standing silently by the coffee maker. As the patron sobbed and scrambled to obey, Anna moved. She didn't run. She flowed. Her first action was to untie the knot on her apron strings. It came undone with a single, practiced flick of her wrist. The apron fell to the floor, a mundane object shed like a skin, symbolizing the complete transformation. Her hand went not to a weapon, but to a heavy, cast-iron skillet sitting on a cold stovetop. Her grip was perfect, balanced, turning the piece of cookware into a formidable bludgeon. The first assailant was still shouting, turning to cover the cowering room, when Anna closed the distance. She moved on the balls of her feet, a phantom in a waitress uniform. The skillet swung in a tight, devastating arc, connecting with the side of the man's head with a sickening thud that was somehow louder than the gunfire outside. There was no follow-through, no wasted energy. It was a single, precise application of force. The man collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut, his rifle clattering to the floor. The second assailant spun around, his eyes wide with shock behind his mask, his rifle starting to come up. He was too slow. Anna was already in motion, a blur of deadly efficiency. She kicked the fallen rifle across the slippery, grease-coated floor, sending it spinning into the darkness under a booth. As the second man tried to track her movement, his feet slid on a patch of spilled soda. It was a small thing, a detail no one else would have noticed, but Anna had already incorporated it into her tactical map. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the pot of scalding hot coffee she had so carefully placed down moments before. It was not a wild, desperate act. Her arm moved with the precision of a piston, the hot, black liquid arcing through the air in a perfect, targeted stream, aimed directly at the narrow eye-slit of his mask. The man screamed, a high, agonized sound of pure agony as the boiling coffee found its mark. He clawed at his face, momentarily blind and disoriented, his rifle firing a wild burst into the ceiling, raining down plaster and dust. It was the opening she needed. She closed the final few feet, and her movements became a symphony of controlled violence. A palm heel strike to the nose, a knee driven into the femoral nerve on his thigh, a swift, disabling chop to the wrist of his weapon hand, forcing him to drop the rifle. Each blow was delivered to a specific, vulnerable point, designed not to kill, but to neutralize, to dismantle a threat piece by piece. Within 10 seconds of them entering the diner, both heavily armed men were on the floor, one unconscious, the other writhing in agony, completely disarmed and incapacitated. A profound, deafening silence descended upon the diner, broken only by the man's pained whimpering and the distant, fading sirens. The cowering patrons and the two deputies outside, who now peered cautiously through the broken window, stared in stunned, absolute disbelief. Sheriff Brody, peeking over the counter, his own gun still held in a trembling hand, looked as if he had just witnessed the laws of physics being personally rewritten and then beaten into submission with a frying pan. The old man in the corner booth rose to his feet. He moved with a stiff, deliberate grace that belied his age, his presence suddenly filling the room with an authority that was quiet, profound, and utterly absolute. The ambient fear in the air seemed to recede before him, replaced by a palpable sense of order being restored. The two young deputies, their faces a mixture of shock and awe, began to step through the shattered frame of the doorway, their service weapons still drawn and shaking. The old man raised a single, steady hand. "Son," he said, his voice calm, but carrying the unmistakable resonance of command, "holster your weapon. The threat is neutralized." It was not a request. The deputy, without a moment's hesitation, did as he was told, his training and instincts recognizing a superior authority figure, even one in civilian clothes. The old man's gaze swept the room, taking in the neutralized assailants, the terrified patrons, and the trembling, useless form of Sheriff Brody still hiding behind the counter. His eyes, however, came to rest on Anna. She stood in the center of the room, her breathing even, her posture relaxed but ready. She was surrounded by the debris of her brutally efficient work, yet she seemed completely untouched by the chaos, an island of calm in a sea of wreckage. The old man approached her slowly, his steps measured. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't comment on what she had just done. Instead, he looked at her hands, at the way she was unconsciously flexing and relaxing her fingers, a subtle routine to dispel the adrenaline. Then his eyes narrowed on a small detail. Around her wrist was a simple, black band, a woven cord that most would mistake for a cheap bracelet. But he recognized the material Technora, a fire-resistant, high-strength synthetic fiber used in parachute lines and special operations gear. And he recognized the knot, a double fisherman's bend, tied with a precision that spoke of countless hours of practice. It was a small, almost invisible piece of a hidden world, a quiet signal to those who knew the language. He stopped a few feet from her. His voice was low, meant only for her, but in the dead silence of the diner, it carried. "You favor the port side when you clear a room," he stated, not asked. Fast and final. "Reminds me of a certain training exercise in the kill house at Dam Neck." Anna's eyes, which had been scanning the room, finally met his. For the first time, a flicker of something other than cold professionalism crossed her face. It was recognition. It was respect. "You have a good memory, sir," she replied, her voice quiet, steady. MRE coffee never tasted as good as it did after those runs. A ghost of a smile touched the old man's lips. It was the confirmation he needed. The password had been spoken. The countersign returned. He had not just witnessed a brave act by a civilian. He had witnessed a master craftsman at her trade. The waitress uniform was just camouflage, and the diner was just another battlefield she had effortlessly conquered. The old man, Admiral Hayes of the United States Navy, retired, turned away from Anna and faced the rest of the room. His entire demeanor had shifted. He was no longer a quiet old man having coffee. He was a commanding officer on the deck of his flagship. His gaze fell upon Sheriff Brody, who was now shakily climbing to his feet, trying to reclaim some shred of his shattered authority. "You," the Admiral said, his voice cutting through the air like a shard of ice. "Sheriff, come here." Brody hesitated, a flicker of his old arrogance warring with the new, terrifying reality. He took a hesitant step forward. The Admiral pulled a small, rugged satellite phone from the inner pocket of his worn tweed jacket, a piece of technology that seemed utterly at odds with his folksy appearance. He dialed a number from memory, his fingers moving with practice speed. The call connected almost instantly. "This is Hayes. Authorization code Victor Alpha 99er. Give me the unclassified service abstract for Vance, Anna." "Vance." Yes. That 1 inch he listened for a moment, his eyes never leaving Brody's face. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation. Then, the Admiral began to speak, his voice a cold, level cadence that recited a litany of honor and sacrifice. "Chief Petty Officer Anna Vance," he began, his voice resonating with a deep, reverent authority. "Retired. Last billet. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. You probably know them by their old name, SEAL Team 6, Sheriff. But even that doesn't do them justice. These are the people we send when the angels are afraid to tread." He paused, letting the weight of the name settle into the room. 16 years of distinguished service. Over a dozen operational deployments to contested environments. Recipient of the Silver Star for actions during Operation Nomad Serpent, where she single-handedly defended a compromised diplomatic outpost for 3 hours against overwhelming forces until reinforcement could arrive. He continued, his voice unwavering. Bronze Star with valor device. Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, meaning she was wounded in combat on 3 separate occasions and returned to the fight each time. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. Expert qualifications in every firearm in the NATO arsenal, and a master of 16 different forms of hand-to-hand combat. He lowered the phone. The call finished. He took a step toward Brody, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "You struck a national hero, Sheriff. You humiliated a woman who has bled for the very freedoms you so casually abuse. You mistook a lifetime of discipline for weakness. You saw a waitress uniform and assumed it was the sum of her worth. You, in your cheap authority and your loud-mouthed ignorance, are not fit to polish her boots, let alone stand in her presence. He stopped directly in front of Anna. The admiral, a man who had briefed presidents and commanded fleets, drew himself up to his full height. His back went ramrod straight. His hand snapped up in a salute so crisp, so perfect it seemed to cut the air. It was a gesture of the absolute highest respect, a public acknowledgement of her sacrifice and her status as a member of the most elite warrior class on the planet. "Chief Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "it is my profound honor. The first coffee is on me." The story of what happened at the Last Stop Diner did not just spread, it detonated. It moved through the small, dusty town of Harmony Creek like a wildfire through dry grass. Leaping from the deputies' hushed, off-field retellings at the station to the breathless gossip over backyard fences, to the wide-eyed tales told by truckers over CB radios 100 miles down the interstate. By nightfall, everyone knew. By the next morning, the legend was already beginning to crystallize. It was no longer just a story about a waitress stopping a robbery. It had become the tale of the angel of the counter, a quiet, unassuming woman who had called down a righteous and terrible judgment upon the corrupt and the arrogant. The details, as they always do, began to shift and embellish in the telling. The cast-iron skillet became a mythical weapon. The skillet of justice, the stream of hot coffee became a river of fire, but the core truth, the undeniable heart of the story, remained intact. A quiet professional, underestimated and insulted, had revealed herself through an act of impossible competence, and in doing so, had broken the spell of fear that had held the town captive for years. Sheriff Brody's downfall was as swift as it was silent. The Admiral's phone call had not been merely for show. It had activated a network that operated in the highest echelons of government. Within 48 hours, 2 unmarked sedans from the state capitol rolled into town, carrying quiet men in sharp suits who introduced themselves as being from the office of the Inspector General. They didn't interview Brody, they informed him. He was placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a full investigation into his department's finances, his record of civilian complaints, and his conduct during the armored van incident. His badge and firearm were confiscated on the spot, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet, sterile, bureaucratic procedure that was infinitely more humiliating. Stripped of his uniform and his symbols of power, Brody seemed to shrink, becoming just another paunchy, middle-aged man with whiskey on his breath and fear in his eyes. His reign was over, not with a bang, but with a quiet rustle of paperwork. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief, a long, shuddering exhalation of tension that had been held for a decade. People started looking each other in the eye again. The nervous, forced laughter that had once greeted Brody's jokes was replaced by genuine smiles. The air itself felt cleaner, lighter, and at the center of it all was Anna. The diner became a local shrine. People would drive from 3 counties over just to sit in a booth and order a cup of coffee, hoping to be served by her. They would speak in hushed, reverent tones, watching her move between the tables, refilling sugar dispensers, and wiping down counters with that same unnerving, methodical calm. She accepted none of it. She refused the tips that were suddenly 5 times larger than the bill. She politely declined the local newspaper's request for an interview. When a mayor tried to present her with a hastily created key to the city, she simply said, "Thank you, but I have to get this order out before the eggs get cold." Her refusal to engage with her own legend only made it more powerful. She wasn't a hero seeking glory. She was a professional who had simply done her job when the situation demanded it. Her continued, quiet competence was a living testament to the story's central lesson, a daily reminder that true strength doesn't require a stage or an audience. It just requires a task to be done and the will to do it right. The diner, once just a greasy spoon on the edge of nowhere, transformed into the heart of the community's newfound spirit. The owner, a man named Sal who had spent years cowering under Brody's thumb, now walked with his shoulders back. He repaired the broken window himself, and instead of replacing the bullet holes in the wall behind the counter, he framed them, creating a small, silent monument to the day the town's fear had shattered along with the glass. A new energy took root in Harmony Creek. People started fixing up their storefronts. A young couple, encouraged by the shift in the town's atmosphere, bought the old abandoned hardware store and began renovating it. The fear that Brody had cultivated had acted like a weed, choking the life out of the town, and with him gone, things could finally grow again. Anna, despite her best efforts to remain anonymous, became a quiet, gravitational force for good. She never preached or lectured. Her lessons were taught through action, through the quiet example of her discipline. One afternoon, she saw a local teenager, a boy named Leo, struggling to change a flat tire on his beat-up pickup truck, cursing and kicking the hubcap in frustration. Anna walked out of the diner, wiping her hands on a clean rag. She didn't offer to do it for him. Instead, she knelt down and pointed. "Your lug nuts are reverse threaded on this model," she said, her voice even. "You're tightening them, then." She showed him how to properly position the jack, how to use his body weight for leverage on the tire iron, how to tighten the nuts in a star pattern to ensure the wheel was seated correctly. She turned a moment of teenage frustration into a masterclass in methodical problem solving. Leo never forgot it. He started spending more time at the diner, not just to see her, but to absorb her sense of calm, her quiet focus. He started doing better in school, his grades improving as he applied that same methodical approach to his studies. He was the first of many. Anna became an unlikely mentor, a silent guide for the town's youth, teaching them not self-defense, but self-reliance, not aggression, but the quiet confidence that comes from genuine competence. The symbolic artifact of that day was not a plaque or a statue. It was something far more subtle. One of the heavy ceramic coffee mugs had been chipped during the melee. Instead of throwing it away, Sal washed it and placed it on a small shelf behind the counter. On the chip, Anna, using a fine-tipped marker, had drawn a tiny, almost invisible trident, the symbol of the Navy SEALs. It was a secret shared between her, Sal, and Admiral Hayes, who made a point to stop by for coffee whenever he was driving through the state. It was a quiet nod to the truth. A humble icon of the day, a waitress reminded an entire town that the most dangerous people are the ones you never see coming, and that the greatest strength is the kind that has no need to ever announce its own name. The mug, with its tiny, hidden symbol, became the diner's true legacy, a testament to the fact that heroism isn't about the uniform you wear, but about the character you reveal when all the pretense is stripped away. 5 years passed. The transformation of Harmony Creek was not just complete, it was profound. The town felt reborn, breathing air free from the taint of corruption and fear. The renovated hardware store was thriving. A new bookstore had opened, and the town square, once a dusty, neglected patch of dirt, now hosted a farmer's market every Saturday. The change was palpable, a testament to what can happen when a single act of courage realigns the moral compass of an entire community. The sheriff's office was now run by Sheriff Miller, the young deputy who had been the first to holster his weapon on the Admiral's command that day. The lesson of the last stop diner had been seared into his soul. He had rebuilt the department from the ground up, instilling a new culture based on humility, service, and respect. His deputies were trained not just in law enforcement, but in de-escalation and community engagement. The primary lesson, repeated to every new recruit on their first day, was known colloquially as the Waitress rule. Sheriff Miller would stand with the rookie in his office, which overlooked the town square and the diner beyond. "Look out that window," he'd say. "You see that diner?" 5 years ago, the most dangerous person in this entire county was in that building, wearing a waitress's uniform. And our boss at the time, a man who judged everyone by the surface, decided to insult and assault her. It was the last mistake he ever made in that uniform. He would then tell them the story, not the mythologized version, but the stark, factual account of what he had witnessed. The impossible calm, the brutal efficiency, the quiet validation from an admiral. "Never assume," he would conclude, his voice low and serious. "Never judge a book by its cover. Your job is to look for character, not credentials. To see the truth of a person, not the costume they're wearing. The loudest person in the room is almost always the weakest. It's the quiet ones you have to respect. The ones who just do the work." The lesson had become institutional folklore, a foundational myth for a new, better era of law enforcement in the county. And Anna? She was still there. She had eventually bought the diner from Sal when he decided to retire and move closer to his grandchildren. The place was hers now, and it ran with the same quiet efficiency as everything else she touched. It was clean, the food was good, and the service was impeccable. She was no longer just Anna the waitress. She was Anna, the owner of the last stop, a respected pillar of the community she had inadvertently saved. She never spoke of that day. She never had to. Her presence was enough. Every morning, as Sheriff Miller drove to work, he would pass the diner, and Anna would be outside, unlocking the front door. They would share a simple nod, a silent acknowledgement of the history that bound them, a shared understanding of the legacy that had been forged in the crucible of a single, violent afternoon. The respect between them was unspoken, unshakable, and earned. True legacy is not etched in stone or cast in bronze. It is woven into the fabric of the lives that continue after you. It is not a monument you leave behind, but a principle that moves forward, carried in the actions and beliefs of others. Anna Vance's legacy was not in the framed bullet holes on the diner wall or in the hushed stories told by strangers. It was in the confident gaze of the young man she taught to change a tire, who now ran his own successful auto shop. It was in the steady hand of Sheriff who taught his deputies to lead with humility, not arrogance. It was in the laughter of children playing in a town square that was no longer shadowed by fear. Her triumph was not the 10 seconds of brutal, physical victory. It was the years of quiet, positive change that followed. It is the silence that defines the true professional, for their work speaks for them. It is the calm that is their greatest weapon, for it allows them to see the world as it is, not as their fear paints it. It is the competence that is their true voice, a language understood in every culture, in every crisis, speaking a universal truth of capability and purpose. Assumptions are the enemies of wisdom. They are the cheap, flimsy armor of the insecure, the loud pronouncements of the ignorant. Sheriff Brody built his world on a foundation of assumptions about gender, about profession, about appearance. And that world crumbled to dust the moment it collided with the bedrock of reality. He assumed a waitress was weak. He assumed a woman was helpless. He assumed his badge made him strong. He learned, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that a uniform is just cloth and a title is just air. True strength is internal. It is the product of 1,000 hours of discipline, a million moments of choosing the harder right over the easier wrong. It is a quiet, unshakable core of self-knowledge that requires no external validation, no applause, and no recognition. It simply is. The world is full of noise, of people clamoring for attention, demanding respect they have not earned. But beyond that noise, in the quiet corners of the world, in diners and workshops, in labs and classrooms, the quiet professionals continue their work. They're the load-bearing walls of our society. They don't ask for thanks, and they don't seek the spotlight. They simply ensure that when the storm comes, the house will stand. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.